Ah, yes. Yeah, there we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Social Movements and Parties in a Fractured Media Landscape. I am Dan. Next to me is Lorenzo. We're absolutely delighted to have you here today. And we're going to kick off with a couple of reflections, thoughts, very brief thoughts, shorts, Freudian slip there, given the weather. And then we're going to move on to listen to our first keynote for today. Donatella Della Porta is going to join us in a minute. So I'm delighted to open the session. I'll say a few things, and Lorenzo will as well. Just by way of a reminder, really, and I'm sure that if you've had a chance to study the conference program, you will have noticed already that the purpose of our symposium is to try and probe relationships, really in the plural, between movements and parties in context. So we're going to hear from people from across the world, and we want to focus on media and the media landscape that movements and parties operate in. We've tried to cover the span of the political spectrum, if you will, and multiple geographical areas. And in terms of how we see the event, we imagine it or envisage it as an opportunity, if you want, for cross-pollination of insights into the left and the right, the progressive and the reactionary, the north and the south. And I think it's really in very large part down to your contribution. And with it, we're going to be able to turn our attention to actions, agency, cultures, organizations, practices, structures, technologies of recent and contemporary social movements and their political vehicles, movement parties. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lorenzo, and thank you again for being here. You're going to hear us thanking you over and over again. We are delighted that you're here. Thank you.
No? Okay. Thank you, Dan. It's a really great pleasure for us to welcome you all in this wonderful but also hot city. And we look forward to your presentation and discussion in these 2 days. We want to thank the Scuola Normale for providing an important economic support for this conference, as well as logistics and administrative facilities, the City University of London, and the International Journal Information, Communication and Society, which will publish a special issue with a selection of the paper presented in this conference. A special thanks goes to the administration of the Scuola Normale Superiore, Federica, Valentina, and Alberta, which were extremely helpful in organizing this event. So before leaving the floor to our first keynote, I just want to remind you briefly other editions of this symposium which were held here in Italy. I want to mention them as I think these were important events to build like an epistemic community, although very heterogeneous. And many of us have learned a lot from these experiences, and have also established important scientific and human relations in these occasions. So I wish the same success to this symposium. We had the first symposium in Florence in 2007 at the University of Florence with the title Changing Politics Through Digital Networks. It was October 2007. And you can already see from the title that we were a bit naive at the time concerning digital media and their impact on politics. It was a small symposium with just 22 paper givers. Then there was another one in Alghero, in the city of Alghero, at the University of Sassari in 2015, protest participation in variable communication ecologies. This was a big event with almost 100 participants. This time we tried to do something in between because we wanted to be a bit more, come back to the idea of a symposium. So we have some parallel sessions, but it's more restricted. So we have this social movement and parties in a fractured media landscape. I think we have like 39 paper givers, so it's a good number. As Dan said, we have it's very various in terms of geographical spread of participants. We have people coming from different disciplines working across boundaries. We mix senior and junior scholars, and also we keep an eye to gender balance, and we think the final result is quite good. But what I wanted to add, and I'm very proud of this, is that we succeeded this time in involving a great deal of colleagues working on Latin America. In the previous edition of this symposium in Florence, we learned about the tensions and challenges of ICTs within the grammar of participatory budgeting. And in the past years, we have been learning a lot from Latin America and in Europe regarding the transition from movements to parties, as well as on the inclusive variant of populism. And of course, Latin America also has a growing tradition of studies on social movements, which sometimes remains a bit disconnected with Western kind of scholarship. So the last point, I said that the first symposium we held in Italy was in 2007. There was a center-left government at that time. Now, you know, we have the so-called yellow-green government. And you know, because the very recent facts regarding immigration in Lampedusa, we are a bit sad about these events, what happened on Saturday, and so we hope, this is just an hope for the next symposium, that we will have a different situation, at least institutionally, and we hope to have open arms for the future. So thank you for being here. I think now we can leave the floor to our first keynote, Donatella Della Porta. She's the Dean of the Department of Political and Social Sciences here at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence, the Director of Cosmos, the Center of Social Movement Studies, the Director of the PhD program in Political Science and Sociology. I don't have to add anything because everybody knows Donatella. I just want to say that knowing her for a long time, I remember that interest for communication and media has always been a bit in the background of her interests, so not in the foreground, but she has been very important to push some of us, of our supervisee, to work on this topic and to develop expertise on this topic. So I think this event today, also we have to thank Donatella for inspiring us very much to tackle this issue. And now I leave the floor to Donatella. Thank you. Okay, so we need just a moment for the presentation, sorry. Okay.
Very hot. Okay. Okay, now we start with multitasking. I'm talking and he's looking for the PowerPoint. And first of all, I want to thank Dan and Lorenzo for the organization of these 2 days and for the invitation to open the 2 days with a keynote on social movements and media. As Lorenzo mentioned, in fact, I'm not an expert on media studies, but I've met with the need to try to understand transformations in media and communications, because social movements are fundamentally actors that rely a lot upon the communications. They have to influence a large audience, and they use forms of communications in many different aspects of their activities. And also, they tend to innovate in communications. So there has been a lot of historical research saying that, observing that social movements have been at the same time very much influenced, but have also influenced all the new technologies at the time. So the importance of mass media has been very high. Historically, the printing press represented a change in the ways in which movements organized, and then all the different type of new innovations have affected mass media. And okay, I can come there. That I start to feel quite old, because at several of the conferences in which the innovations in different areas are reflected upon, sometimes there is a tendency to stress discontinuities. And as I said, I start to feel older, because when I start to think about my own experience in the past, I also see a lot of continuities instead. And this is an impression that I have also sometimes when dealing with new concepts in communications and social movements. So sometimes the ideas about the movements of the past tend to be a bit simplified, and concepts emerge as applying only to new movements, that instead I think sometimes would have been helpful, or are helpful also to understand the past. So I will start these keynotes with some memories that I read as indications of the fact that even a long time ago, it was, and it would have been helpful to think in terms of media landscape, to think in terms of multiple forms of communications, to think in terms of multiple actors, and so to media activists as not just specialists in communications, but at the everyday life of activism as involving also communications. So I wrote this for an introduction to a section of a book that Trere and others have published on practices, but I thought it could be fit also to start this keynote. So these are my own memories of about 50 years ago, a little bit less, but not so much less. The student movement I experienced directly as a teenager activist in Sicily was dense in communication practices. In terms of production, we were intensively involved in writing documents for internal use and leaflets for circulations, but also journal articles for sympathetic outlets, even books for movement near publishers. The networks of students collective I was part of also engaged in artistic productions, at times even of good quality, not always, but sometimes. We had photographic commissions that documented sufferance and resistance to it, cinema commissions that even rented a cinema theater to screen public movies and documentaries. After important protest events, we wrote a sort of press release that we dutifully delivered to the local right-wing daily, which almost never published it, and not even a small part of it, a fact that annoyed us a bit but was not really considered as very important, as we did not aim to impress what we considered to be the conservative audience of that newspaper. While we did not call them graffitis, we did write our slogans on the walls, especially in front of schools and universities. The various products of our communicative activities were distributed using existing technologies with some creativity. We usually typed our text on stencil to be used with mimeographs, which we had pushed universities' administrations to put at the disposal of students for self-organized cultural activities. I did this, but so did other male comrades, so I'm not really convinced by the image of the female comrades as the angels of the mimeograph. Our posters were written by hand using multicolor marker pens. Only occasionally we collected money to have our leaflets or posters printed by sympathetic professionals. Calls from meetings and protest events circulated by posters or telephone chains, each of us calling other 5 comrades, usually from our parents' telephones. The mail system was used sparingly, mainly for sending movement journals that we then sold at our schools at the risk of being charged with unauthorized selling. As censorship was frequent, the distributions of propaganda materials, such as written text of artistic performances, often brought about police charges for attacks against morality and apology of crime. I collected a few of these, but fortunately there was then an amnesty. Only a few cars, often small and on short loan from relatives, were available to take leaflets, musical instruments, and documentaries around. Motorbikes, small ones, were used creatively to transport posters, glue-full buckets, and brushes for wild posting all around the city. We ourselves traveled to do political work at the periphery of the cities or in the province, mainly by bus, train, or hitchhiking. And finally, we consumed much of what we had produced within the alternative circuits, our own or in the broader countercultures. With no cell phone and no internet, we were nevertheless creative in our communication practices, even if distributions was quite challenging. In the collective productions of communications, rights were slow but intense, with activists contributing in different communicative streams with different competences and skills. So these are my memories. I don't think many in the room can share this type of memories, but maybe some of you does. I collected them and I mentioned them because I think at the same time we see how different the means were that we tended to use. But also I had a memory, or I have an impression of similarities in many things that we did, and especially the impressions that what we did was not easy to address within the more orthodox approaches to social movements and to media communications that tended to spread stereotypical ideas that I think some new developments in communication studies would helpfully help to challenge. The implications of this that I want to discuss in these presentations. One is it was never just the mass media. It was a hybrid media context in which many means of communications, transportations, interactions were used without really reflecting much about the technological affordances that were required. It was never just communication specialists. I think media studies didn't exist at that time, or just as a very specialized field of studies. None of us was studying media studies, but we had developed a sort of repertoires, what Charles Tilly would call a repertoires, in the sense of building upon an history of forms of communications and trying to innovate at the margins by using all the means that came to be available. So this, for instance, type of pictures that I just read would have been slightly different at the time of the fax, which was considered as a sort of big revolutions at the moment in which it happened, because it meant the possibilities to reduce a lot the expenses for communications. Now it's a joke if you compare it with internet, but at the time, fax became so important that there were movements that were defined as movements of the fax. So never communication specialist, never just strategic. This is another point that I want to emphasize. We did what needed to be done. We did press releases in languages that were very difficult to be understood by non-activists, but it was not really our main aim to influence the mass media, which we considered to be as very unsympathetic to us, and I think rightly so. But there was a lot of embedded norms that went through our forms of communications. And also, I think something relevant is that we tended to use communications in the different stages in which it is useful for political activities, in producing news, in distributing news, and in consuming news. I think this challenges a bit the ways in which social movement studies have addressed communications in the past, especially in two perspectives. So one perspective has been considering media as opportunities. This has been the ways through which media studies have encountered social movement studies. The idea that together with political type of opportunities, there were also media type of opportunities, so that different mass media environment tended to be more or less keen and more or less open to social movements' messages, but mainly the idea was they tended to be closed. So it was a sort of trap, because at the same time mass media were considered to be needed by social movements in order to communicate, but they were considered to be very distant. So social movement studies for a period relied upon protest event analysis, which was collecting information about protest in the media, and this made scholars very aware of the fact that media are selective, so that media report on a very tiny minority of protest, not only a tiny minority, but not the representative ones. So that media have a bias in terms of what they report about social movements. They report only protests that are either new in their forms or massive in their numbers or violent, but they tend to report very rarely other forms of protest. Not only there is a bias in the number of events reported, but also there is a descriptive type of bias, in the sense that the media tend to work through usual practices in which activists are not the preferred type of interlocutors. And so this type of observations about the media opportunities as considering the media as sort of gatekeepers was really, I think, was useful on the one hand, but it was also frustrating on the others, because it considered also protest events as events only if they were reported by the mass media. While in my own account, what I would like to stress is the fact that as many activists in the past and in the present don't look just at the media. It's nice to be on the media, but it's not the main type of aim. And it could also be that other forms of protest, other type of frames and so on are chosen than the ones that would be welcomed by the media, because movements also have other type of aims than addressing the public opinion through the mass media. There is another way of a traditional way of looking at communication in social movement studies, which I also think has been useful, but I think insufficient. The other one is maybe more distorting the reality of the activities of the activist in terms of communications. This other ways has been useful, but I think it's focused a bit too much the attention only on some outlets. So there has been attention in social movement studies to sort of alternative media, activist media, citizens media, radical autonomous media. In Downing definitions, they represent radical alternative media as the most active form of the active audience and express oppositional strands overt and covert within popular culture. So the idea is, and the type of object of these studies were alternative newspapers like Libération in France or Manifesto in Italy or Taz in Germany, newspapers that tended to represent directly the movements. And there were observations about the type of alternative forms of news productions and communications which were important. But I think this was only part of the communication activities, so that we could not focus only on this type of outlets if we want to reflect on the complex ways in which social movements use mass media. And in this process of trying to understand the more complex ways in which social movements have communicated and have innovated communications, I think that the concept of practices is useful in several directions. So Nick Couldry has put forward the idea of practices as moving the focus from the specialist of communications to the interactions between what once used to be considered the audience and the producers. So while the audience has been long considered as passive, the idea of practices considered also the active agency of the public when using the mass media. But it is so new ways of consuming the media which also contest the legitimacy of media powers, but is also attention to new infrastructures of productions that, says Couldry, have an effect on who can produce news and in which circumstances, and also the complex apparatus of distributions of the information. So what I would like to do now in the rest of the presentations is focusing attention on some of the concepts which I think have been very usefully introduced in the literature, not by me, but by many of those who, coming from media studies or coming from social movement studies, came together to try to understand the ways in which movements communicate. And then try to reflect on one element which Lorenzo has in part mentioned in the beginning, which is the normative dimensions related also with the conflicts of our time. Which make communications particularly important, and digital media in particular considered as a resource, but also a high-risk type of communications in intense time. So one of the elements I think is important to stress when looking at social movements and protests is the presence of complex media environment. Alice Mattoni has defined this complex media environment as open, unpredictable, and controversial space of mediatizations and communications made up of different layers which continuously combine with one another due to the information flows circulating within media environment itself. Something that I wanted to stress in my memories and in reading my memories is the fact that sometimes we reason as if each new technique erased the previous one, while in the practices we see that we still use pencils, so we still use very old means of communications, we still talk to each other, and very often also social movements have stressed the importance of the old means of communications, as by the way have also political parties in developing forms of campaigns that return to face-to-face type of encounters, so that it wouldn't make sense to focus only on the specific type of technological constraints and opportunities of some media, because no organizations that I know of uses just one type of media, but it is in the type of interactions, balances through which these media are used that you can try to understand the ways in which this complex media environment is produced. And this, I think, is true even of the most, digital media-oriented organizations like hackers or like organizations that promote especially online forms of protest. It is never just online. And the complexity of these communications is, I think, important to observe. There is also the elements that I wanted to stress, and I mentioned the fact that it is not only one type of actors, but it is many different actors. In social movement studies, recently there has been a move towards considering fields and arenas. So not to consider actors as separated, isolated from other actors, but considering the network of interactions they are embedded in. And I think that in terms of communications, this is also a useful exercise. A lot of media studies in the past, rightly so, legitimate orientations have, for instance, looked at the specific habitus of journalists or experts of communications. I think this is useful, but when we look in particular at social movements, we have to consider that specialists constitute a very tiny minorities. Only an extremely small numbers of the social movement organizations have enough resources and enough trust in journalism to devote material resources to hire specialists, but activists tend to become, to a certain extent, specialists, to assume different types of roles, and especially, as Caldry said, there is people exercise their agencies in relations to the media flows, and the media flows is complex because it's made of the very different type of media outlets. So I think that these are important concepts and reflections that have penetrated very much the domain of social movement studies and on media communication. So I tried to, first of all, put forward the two most traditional way of looking at media, but I recognize that all this type of studies, since especially the years 2000s, have moved in what I think is the right directions. And so concepts like media landscape, like media environments, like practices are, I think, very useful. There is another point which I want to make before moving to give some examples about the type of communications that we have been studying that I think bridge social movements with other actors, is the fact that communications is not just technologies, but that it is very dense in terms of norms. They are not always explicit, but I think that especially nowadays it is important to reflect about communications not only in terms of which type of actors, social movement or political parties or administrations, but also and especially in terms of which types of aims. So which type of conceptions for democracy, which is something that we have studied with Lorenzo when studying the Web 1.0 revolution. So web pages, for instance, differed not only according to the type of material resources that were invested in them, but also very much in terms of the normative conceptions of activists. Not that they succeeded 100% in implementing what they wanted to do, but in the sense that their strategic reasoning was not just oriented towards how much can we affect the public audience in this way, but also what is the correct way, so normative ideas, ideologies, and so on affect communications. And this is why I think also, as a byproduct of this conference, it is interesting that scholars of social movements comes together also with scholars of political parties, because I think it is not just a matter of reflecting on how specific organizations use the media, but also on how progressive versus regressive type of political organizations conceive and implement their forms of communications. So this is an element which I think could be still developed nowadays, and it could also be developed in view of some observations that are emerging about the fact that, for instance, right-wing political groups have a very specific type of use of communications that sometimes is considered to be as even more effective understand the use by progressive type of groups. And I think it is important to look at the practices, but also at the normative dimensions behind these practices, if we want to understand how communication happens and how it could become more effective. I want now to give 4 examples of communications, but very briefly, because I was asked, and I also would like to keep space for the debate. I want to give some examples on 4 different researches which have been developing at Cosmos on different actors. None of this research was focusing on communications, but in all of this research, communications acquired a very fundamental role. One is communicating movements, and in particular the observations about anti-austerity protest movements, which have been considered as the first examples of movements that were heavily affected by the Web 2.0 type of mass media, and that in fact had different types of characteristics than the global justice movements that were instead using Web 1.0. So social movements. Then I want to look also at some of the ways in which I think the ideas by movements spill over into institutional practices, especially into innovative institutional practices like the constitutional, crowdsourced constitutional process in Iceland. Also, how they spilled over in other forms of institutional political events like referendums, like, for instance, the referendums against the privatizations of water supply in Italy, and how also they spill over, not always successfully, but always with some attempted innovations in what we have defined in the work with Lorenzo as movement parties, and the ways in which also there, I think, some of these ideas of multi-level fields, multifarious actors, and interactions of different forms of communications are important to look at. So, first, elements about social movements of, say, the anti-austerity protest, Indignados, Occupy movements, but also more recently Nuit Debout, Gezi Park, and Gilets jaunes. All these type of movements have movements that could have not been thought of in the forms they took without the presence of some specific availability of forms of communications. They've been called Facebook movements. There have been slogans like "revolutions cannot be tweeted." My claim is not that these movements used only type of digital media. So I would not subscribe to definitions like Facebook revolutions. But I think that in the forms that this movement took, of course, the type of affordances, the type of technological resources which were available played an important role. And this is something that in research on social movements, researchers like Lance Bennett or Alexandra Segenberg have pointed at when they stressed the combination, rather I would say than the shift, from networked type of organizations to a more, can say, spontaneous type of forms. Jeff Juris, who has been also studying the Indignados, has pointed at the differences in the impact of technologies between the Web 1.0 movements of the beginning of the years 2000, for which websites or email lists were very important, but they were instruments that still required organizational resources. And instead the use of cell phones, Facebook or tweetings that instead allow for very intense forms of communications without strong organization. So substantially allows for very fast and widespread mobilization, but to a certain extent make resilience more problematic, because the need for organizational building is reduced. And so I think that this type of movements have also to be addressed in their complexity. They have not been movements that have relied only upon digital instruments. To the contrary, if we look at the so-called Arab Spring in Cairo, the movements, the protests at the end of January started exactly because the activists perceived that they could not just rely on likes on Facebook, but they needed to go to the periphery, to mobilize the people also face to face and to be physically there. But this type of new Web 2.0 media were fundamentally in the type of process of the mobilizations. The same is true that you may have recognized. Puerta del Sol is the most symbolic, most relevant symbol of the Indignados movement. And the Indignados movement, or the 15 de Mayo, was a movement that pointed at the importance of face-to-face communication. So you squatted squares to reconstruct polis. You needed to reconquer public spaces by physically occupying them. So it is not a movement that just relied on Facebook or Twitter, but it is a movement in which the use of technologies has been very important, and it has also affected the capacity for the mobilization to spread, but also the forms that it took. I think in reflecting on this type of movements and communications, it is important in terms of reflections on the normative content of the protest and the normative input on communications, to think about the cultural innovations introduced by these movements. So protest waves against austerity were repoliticizing the city after the long period of neoliberal commodifications of space. These were the movements that Chantal Mouffe put as at the origins of what she called the populist movements, as a movement of repolitizations after a long period of depolitizations. These were movements that have used all the type of communications instruments, means, and multifarious and multiple fields in view of spreading anti-establishment type of frames. There have been a lot of research done, among others by people in this room, on the ways in which this movement reflected upon communications. I don't want to go into details, but I think that it is important to consider the use of communications also in terms of strategies, but also of normative type of concerns. So these were movements that opposing corruption, aimed at stressing transparency. They were movements that opposing elite stressed very strongly participation, to the point that direct forms of democracy that had been not so central in the global justice movement became central again. And there were movements that were also influenced by Habermasian ideas of deliberations, as in the squares what had to happen was not just the voting, the making of decisions, but to the opposite, the type of trade-off was between fast acting and slow thinking and discussing, and it was a trade-off that the movements tended to push on the directions of long-lasting deliberation, to the point that there were also debate inside the movements about the need for actions and how much certain type of communication forms that required high discursive quality, like in the Habermasian ideas, could be used by movements without losing in terms of capacity of mobilizing actively and quickly. What I think is interesting, and this is why I think it is more important to think in terms of normative contents than of types of actors that intervene, is that some of these ideas about what are the aims of communication, so transparency, participations, equality in participations, horizontalities, and so on, have spilled over within institutions. This, I think, has been also related with some characteristics of these movements that developed in times of crisis, which were times which were perceived as extremely challenging, but also opening institutional opportunities. So there were times in which institutions reacted with criminalizations and repressions, but also in which there was an sometimes unexpected openings up of institutional opportunities in which I think forms of communications and ideas about communications by the movements themselves became quite important. One of these type of institutional spillover of the ideas of communications that had developed within social movements was in Iceland, which was the first country hit by the financial crisis in 2008, and a country without protest traditions, but in which basically 90% of the citizens at that moment participated in the squares of Reykjavik and the other very small cities in Iceland. And what this movement triggered was not only communication. So I did some research. I was in Iceland, and the Icelandic people, the colleagues I met, all pointed at the movements as opening up of public spheres, as a moment of politizations in which communications became very fundamental, in which people get out of the private spheres and into the public spheres. But there were also important moments in terms of institutional reforms. So maybe you know about the so-called crowdsourced constitutional process which was triggered by these movements and by the perceptions within institutions that what was at stake during the financial crisis was not just some limited type of policies, but it was the very collective identity of the Icelandic nations. And with the support of the president of Iceland at the time, the demands of a constitutional process from below have developed with what has been defined as crowdsourced constitutionalism. So constitutions were considered very much of a political moment. So communications was important and was not just the type of specialized communications among lawyers that had been quite common in the constitutional processes after 1945, but it was communications around contested issues through a political languages. It was a participated moment, and all the forms of communications that had been developed in the movements were also used during the process in order to increase not only the transparency of the constitutional process, but also capacity for deliberations and the participation, so that there was during the process an implementation of a lot of innovations in terms of communications that were aiming at increasing the quality of the deliberation, and so the discursive quality a la Habermas, but also the capacity of the people to participate. And it was communications that was oriented towards the creation of new identity, new collective identities. So it was not just the constitutional reforms. Iceland had no really autonomous constitutions, just introduced the Danish constitutions when they acquired independence from Denmark. But the ways in which the constitutional process was conceived of was communications around the constructions of identities. And I think that this is a very important element and challenges some of the ways in which social movement studies have looked at use of communications as just instrumental. This type of process has been important also as examples. For instance, in Ireland, the referendums that we all knew have followed on important issues like the same-sex marriage or abortion have started through a similar constitutional type of process. Referendums is another area in which I think, at least for some of them, communications became a very important, relevant issues, not only strategic, but also normative, around which some processes tended to develop. So we have studied at Cosmos the referendums against the privatization of water in Italy, but also the referendums in Catalonia and in Scotland. And we have defined these referendums as referendums from below, looking especially at the degree of participations that had developed during the process with the creations of specific public spheres, very often through the participations of social movement organizations. And what we saw here, also in this referendums process, that Matteo Cernisons has studied for the Italian case, is the importance of self-produced type of communications, the creations of small teams of activists thousands of them that have used different forms of technologies in order to create momentums, in order to participate in the protest. And also here the idea of communications as not something for the expert, but something not even just for the activist, but for the normal people to participate in, for innovations, creativity, and especially the potential for horizontal form of communications. So also here, from the point of view of practices, but also from the point of view of norms, this type of referendums were referendums that were highly participated by the citizens, so where the debate developed, and not only on specialist terms, but very much on political debate around the very identity issues, identitarian issues. They were not just communication events, but many of these referendums implied a strong interactions of what is usually studied under the label of referendums campaigns, so communications activities, but also with protest, marches, mass forms of mobilizations, civil disobedience, and other forms of actions that I think help us thinking communications as part of a broader repertoire of protest activities that is not specialized. So the term repertoires has been used also as communication repertoires. I think that we can even go a step forward in thinking about the intertwining between type of communications and type of protest repertoires, with the aim of empowerment. And I think this has been relevant in the ways in which activists and citizens had thought about the type of communications, introducing also here attentions to the quality of the debate, the discursive quality of the debates, but also the participations by different type of actors, not only the specialists. And finally, and time do I have 10 minutes? Okay. I know that there will be several sessions on political parties. I will not go in details of this. They are much more expert than me on the communication dynamics. What I want to point at is that with all their failures, political parties that have emerged during this wave of protest have done a lot in order to try to innovate in the forms of communications. They have done a lot in terms of using new media, but also in terms of thinking about how online and offline forms of communications could interact. Sometimes they are more relevant for their failures than for their successes. They have, from the Five Stars movement to Podemos, they have also been affected by the difficulties in using new technologies in a deliberative ways. But I think that also here it is important to reflect upon the ways in which the type of aims of the organizations were also translated into normative conceptions of communications that also here aimed at combining horizontal forms of participations, transparencies, and participations, even if, as I mentioned, not always or only rarely with some success. I think that here what would be interesting is especially to reflect on these communications by new parties, especially at the local level. I think at the national level, there are more worth studying as failed attempts, but at the local level, there have been allegedly success of some of these groups in using complex communications that have resulted in effectively resisting right-wing populism. And this would be interesting also to address. So looking at movement parties as parties in which there is high level of participations, also in different forms, not only in party arenas, but also in protest arenas, in which there is attention to channels of participations and there is attention to norms of social justice and in deepening of democracies is important in terms of reflecting of new forms of communications. Finally, I think all these elements that I mentioned represent opportunities for thinking about ways in which political actors could use new technologies and old technologies, different forms of communications for progressive aims, for more participations, for more social justice, and so on. But we live in a time in which each time I present some speech on the positive sides of social movements, I'm rightly pointed at also the dark side of social movements, which is also the dark side of digital communications, the dark side of political party, and the dark side of old forms of communications as well. So it is times in which we have to consider that changes are at the same time opportunities but also risks. There are times that Antonio Gramsci defined as time of interregnum, in which the old is dying, the new is not born yet, and morbid symptoms can develop. So they are times in which I think it's extremely important to look at the quick dynamic of political and social processes. And I think that communications is particularly relevant here, also because the new means of communications are changing quickly. So I see it when we study also generational forms of mobilizations. We have done research on the so-called millennials. The type of technologies that are consumed and used tend to change extremely quickly. So in a paper with Elena Pavan, we pointed at this. I read, digital media are tools designed to be in a permanently beta version, that is to be constantly in evolutions. Also, the interplay with collective endeavors is very likely to remain fluid and ever-evolving. All possible transformative effects that digital media may exert on social movement dynamics are played out at the crossroads between material and social factors, and thus are inherently social technical, but also inherently moving, and moving fast. And I think that this is an element on which we have to reflect a lot. There is reflections already, for instance, when talking about big data, on the ways in which new media of informations and communications are used for repression. But I think it is also extremely important to see how new media are used also from the dark side of movement parties, and so on. And this in a moment of what Mark Basinger defined as thickened histories. So not in a moment in which there is a normal flow, in which there is a normal Bourdieusian habits that is transmitted without challenges, but in a moment in which quick changes happens. And in fact, all the things that I mentioned, movement parties, referendums from below, constitutional processes, social movements, have been critical junctures that have transformed very quickly the setting of political and social structures that they were addressing. They represented sort of eventful time. They transformed the structures very quickly, and they occupied then spaces that were left empty by the breakdown produced by the crisis. So I think that in this moment, it is really fundamental for research to try to reflect upon, in comparative ways, about how this type of media, these strategies of communications are used not so much by different actors, social movement, political parties, bureaucracy, but rather by actors aiming at either progress or reactions. And Lorenzo had mentioned the events around the Sea-Watch, and with the arrest of the captain of the boat that was performing search and rescue in the Mediterranean. And this event has been extremely mediatized by the progressive actors that are mobilizing, asking for the release of the captain of Sea-Watch, but also by the other type of actors on the right, the xenophobic forces that have pushed their discourse very much on all forms of media, from the newspapers to the new media. I think that's we need to understand this type of moments. We need to understand the type of strategies and norms that the different actors are using, because in this very intense time, events can be extremely important in affecting the ways in which the challenges are developing. And events is not just what's happening, is what is framed as an event. And in this, I think communications is of fundamental values. So thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you, Donatella, for this very rich and dense presentation. I think we now can open the floor to the discussion, so collect some questions from the public. So maybe Alberta, if you can come with the mic, or you, yeah, Ethan, yeah.
Thank you so much. It was just wonderful to have that history of alternative media coming back into the history of social movements. And I'm hoping perhaps from a historical perspective you can help with this question. I think for those of us who were studying the internet in the 1990s and in the last decade, there was a presumption that having these open platforms for speech would be a progressive force because people whose voices were subjugated previously could now be amplified. I'm noticing in the last few years what my friend Jonathan Zittrain calls the public health theory, which is maybe these platforms are dangerous because I can infect you with dangerous ideology. And so if I'm coming out with fascism or racism or very naked nationalism, maybe it can spread and will have damages. Thinking back to these alternative media spaces that you were active with in Sicily, that have had these deep roots in Italy, did you see a similar shift? Was there a moment where that space for counterpublics went from being inherently progressive to people now asking the question, is this potentially dangerous? And even people on the left, I think, saying, is this potentially dangerous?
Can I please ask everyone to say your name and so briefly introduce yourselves? Thank you.
My name is David. I'm from the University of Glasgow. I'm very pleased to meet you as well. I was trying to organize my question during your presentation because it's from early on, from what you were saying. But basically, to phrase it in a way that I come from politics rather than sociology. And it took me some time in the department to convince mentors and other scholars of the usefulness of the concepts of praxis and hybridity at the same time. Politics people deal with certain authors that are useful for this analysis. Some of you might know Chadwick and Karp's work. One of the main gaps in that literature, though, is that activists, organizations are taken as very strategic and very rational actors. And rational choice theory was left behind quite a long time ago. So perhaps my question is related to, since you are here suggesting and trying to persuade us of this useful terminology and vocabulary to start working on in more as in a common agenda, how will we match that with the tradition of political science, especially if we are today talking about parties as well?
Thank you. They're both very important questions, and I'm trying to continue in my own self-biography, thinking in terms of which were the challenges. Of course, there were serious challenges also in that period, but probably in different types of directions. So what happened in that period was, if we can say, the decline of the movements went together with the sectarianizations of communications, the development of a language which was a language only for political specialists to a certain extent, and also this interacted with transformations in the mass mediatic landscape, because it was the period of also the shift from a more politically influenced type of printed press into a commercialized press. There were, I think, different type of evolutions. So Stefania Milan, for instance, had studied the free radio, which has been quite important in the 70s, in the opening up of channels of interactions, also beyond the restricted areas of activists, creating linkages between political cultures and different types of countercultures, and acting to a certain extent as alternative media, but also as introducing innovations in the media. And there, the specific type of challenge, I think, was commercialization. So the fact that the type of developments towards more and more highly technical type of needs has reduced the thinking about this radio as an activist instrument. But I would also not want to be too pessimistic on the other side, because I think that all the literature on social movements and media has been always shifting between optimism and pessimism. This institute was somehow related with Umberto Eco, that was important in reflecting on studies on communications, and he talked of apocalyptici integrati in the ways in which people looked at the media. And I don't think that the media are per se to be looked at as the big risk or the big solutions. For sure, I think that when one thought about the advantages of internet in terms of allowing for more pluralist and participated forms of technologies, one was pointing at really existing opportunities that social movements have in fact exploited. And I think that would be unthinkable nowadays to have protest campaigns like Fridays for Futures without this spreading of new types of technologies. We had not considered as social movement scholars, especially because we are more happy to study nice movements than the nasty one, is that some types of instruments could have been very useful for the other side as well, both in terms of use of big data for repression or the use of the emotionalities, simplified type of interactions by activists on the xenophobic right. So I still think we shouldn't go back to technological determinism. There are always opportunities and constraints that activists have always tried to exploit and resist to. But I think we have to consider more carefully what is, for instance, in the new media that at the moment seems to facilitate a reactionary type of discourses. So which type of characteristics of commercial platforms and commercial platforms that are defined in a certain way, for instance, in a way in which emotions are highly enhanced, which type of effects it has on communications. I think emotions is not negative per se, but I think that careful analysis is needed. And I think that there is already a lot of good research, but as in social movement studies, also in social movement studies on mass media, there is a sort of pillarization. Those studying nice movements, talking not so much with those studying the other side, and instead I think that some research on parallel ways and strategies and how strategies are related with normative concerns is important. And about the rationality, I think that, and how to convince a department of political scientists that this is important. Well, I think first of all, even political parties, I think, realize that it cannot be everything strategic. So that There is, for instance, a return among political parties to reflect about identities, to reflect about emotions. So there is a transformation also in these very actors. And in fact, not by chance, what I noticed when we select PhD programs is that even in political science, it became more and more interesting to study new parties rather than the old ones. There is very little attention to the social democratic parties in decline and much more attention to the new parties, or the radical left, for instance, and the same on the right. So I think that there is this type of perceptions of the importance of going beyond the old type of research on political parties. And in fact, I saw that many of my colleagues that were specialists on party politics have broadened a lot their attentions to study also at least these forms of institutional outcomes of movements. So, for instance, David Farrell, who is one of the main experts on political parties and editor of journals on political parties and so on, has been one of the promoters and main scholars studying the Irish crowdsourced constitutional process, because I think that there is the perceptions that the crisis, it meant a crisis of that type of actors. And I think in terms of strategies and rationalities, is not, the point would not be to exclude it. Of course, many actors tend to use strategic thinking within the type of habitus, but rationality and strategic thinking can happen only after identities are built. And identities are not built on material interest, but on conceptions. So I think that dimensions of framing social constructions of reality are more and more important. Not by chance, even the economists that have been considered for a long time by mainstream political sciences the example to be followed, they are more and more using experimental methods in order to go beyond the assumptions of rationalities, which is considered to be as more and more constrained. And what I also think is that in intense time, the very even constrained vision of rationalities is difficult to assess, because rationality assumes that you can make a reliable bet on what the other actors would do. But in a situations of quick transformations, all the actors are behaving in a sort of extraordinary ways. So they are trying to become something different than what they were, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. So thinking about traditional parties, think Spain and the Partido Popular. They tried to do something different from what they traditionally did, and they tried to mobilize on a very exclusive form of nationalism. This failed, and the Partido Popular had a big defeat. But the point is not only that they failed, it's also that they were no longer to be assessed using the same type of understandings of what they did and what they would do. So I think that in times of rapid changes, structures which are indispensable for rational thinkings are less capable to constrain behaviors, and so they are insufficient.
Thank you, Donatella. We can collect other questions. I have myself a question. You presented some cases, and I found that some of these cases, seen from the outside, can be seen as failures, because if we think on the crowdsourced constitution in Iceland, or also on the Italian referendum on water, it can be seen as a failure. So I wanted to know if you can say something more about the positive outcomes of these processes, in terms of what does they produce beyond the reaching the specific goals of the referendum or the constitution. So we can collect other questions.
Easier one than this one.
Hi, hello, thanks. I'm Francesco from University of Technology, Sydney, Australia. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I come from politics, so sorry if the question is not too in line with your presentation, but what is really troubling me with social media, especially applied to social movements and parties, is the fact that they're not simply tools, but they are ideals. They are metaphors, and sometimes this is even more powerful in setting the agenda of the movement and setting the way forward than the actual application. And you talk about the fact that most of these applications actually fail. So let's think, I mean, we're in Italy, we can think about the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that the movement, the faster mood is in government, is not still be able to apply all these ideals, okay, in practice. The only thing that they can do is organize this bogus election where a few thousand people vote and we don't know any where the votes are. So I wonder, what do you think about this relationship with this idea? And I think, looking back to other tools that before were used by social movement, if you see anything comparable to this, so this tool that is idealized by people in movement and parties to imagine a different arrangement, a different social arrangement, where users, where citizens, so that are with all the diversity and all inequalities, are now thought of as users. So they're all able to access the same kind of information. They're all able to contribute in the same way. Thank you.
I'm Liartz. I'm from Purdue, and I actually am in media studies. So my question may seem disjoint from my own discipline. I'd like us, and I appreciated your presentation because I thought you moved in that direction, to not essentialize the media. When you talk about media as a metaphor or media as an ideal, I see it simply as a means. Epicurus in 2500 BC, he was talking about how writing was going to pollute the Greek mind because writing was a new form and they wouldn't be able to reason and make decisions. In the 15th century, we had the printing press, which was supposed to undermine society, and certainly Luther used it that way, but the Catholic Church recovered real quick and started making fortunes by selling little cards for penance that will get you into heaven. So there's no way of saying the world was turned upside down either with writing or with the printing press, or I would say with the internet. I know in the US, 40% of the use of the internet is for pornography. Another 25% is for gaming. And then if you add in all the cat videos, I don't know what's really left for fake news or fascism. And it would seem to me it's not so much the means that's at issue, but the content. The Southern Poverty Law Center said that there are not more members of hate groups now than there were 40 years ago. So we haven't been infected by something that came from the media. The ideas are there. The anti-immigrant sentiment seems to me to be based upon something beyond the media, and it seems like social movements, as you gave examples, always find the means to communicate. It may be social media or Twitter, or it may be a can of red and black paint like the Sandinistas. So I think it's good that we move away from the technology as being a cause and see it more as a means, which raises for me the question throughout is who owns the means? What are the social relations that go into producing the content? Because that, to me, is the question for social movements, not to speak truth to power, but be able to speak their own power. So it's not that the media will be the transformative impetus, but the content and the organization will be the impetus The means will work itself out. It may or may not be any particular form of the media.
Okay, thank you. I think that many of the answers will come also during the various discussions during these days. But I also want to try to give some answer. I think that, in fact, we cannot assess just the and it was not my purpose to assess the final outcomes, referring to Lorenzo's questions. So the water referendum was a success in terms of the results of the referendum. It passed the quorum, which had not happened for decades in Italy. There is a quorum of 50% plus one. And the referendum succeeded in achieving it. And the percentage of those who expressed their vote against the privatizations of water supply was 96%, so comma something. So it was extremely high. Of course, it would be wrong to consider that this as an indicator that 96% of the Italians were really becoming interested in the commons and potentially mobilizing against all forms of privatizations. And it is true that given the particular political systems which the Italian political system is, the results of the referendum have not been implemented strictly. But there have been other type of outcomes. So I think that the politizations of the debate is something long-lasting. And it is important because it has affected also further developments of ideas of commons and the commoning rather than commercializations and commodifications of public goods. And what remained was also the examples of movements that could be successful in impacting the public opinion. And I think research like the one of Matteo Cernison's also help showing when and how the movements could be effective in its communication. So how it could address different audiences through different type of means. I think exploiting the specific characteristics of some medias, so using, for instance, irony rather than heavy messages when using new digital media. So I think that this is something important, and in fact there have been outcomes like the development of movements for the commons also in other areas like public culture, the theaters and so on. There have been public citizens' initiatives at the European level against privatization of water. So I think it was successful in setting in motion a debate, opening a public sphere. Then no public sphere is the idealized Habermasian public spheres, in which communications is, say, high quality, informations are there and the best argument wins. But it was a process in which many things that had been taken for granted, like privatizations, were challenged. And I think this had sort of long-lasting consequences. And for scholars, the reflections on this type of, say, campaigns is important in order to understand, especially in a world in which we are living with a lot of dark sides. When do we have instead successful movement? Also, when looking at this Icelandic context, it was also a context in which immediately the crowdsourced constitutional process failed, in the sense that the decisions was not implemented by the parliament, but it re-emerged now with a leadership, with elected politicians that are once again more open to the constitutional process. And it was important in creating a sort of common identities. So I think that the search is in itself positive, the search for communications means that can be effective. And that's, if we want to understand when campaigns for progressive aims are successful, focus attentions to these cases, like the victory of the progressive mayors in Istanbul, are important cases to study. So how is communications used in successful cases, and what are the outcomes? That sometimes is not just the final outcomes, but the process, which I think is important. About the metaphors and the instrumental type instead of visions of the means. I think that's what we find when we look at this type of campaigns is that there is both strategic use of different forms of communications, different instruments of communications, and that some actors are particularly strategic. So there are the people who are more concerned also about the specific rights related to communications and informations that tend to be also more sophisticated very often in thinking and using some types of repertoires of actions. But I think that as for other forms, is always a mix of the normative concerns and the strategic type of concerns. So in some movements, you find a strong type of belief in the potentials of some types of techniques. So Acker's movement, for instance, are different from other movements in the way in which they see the instruments as also more than just a means. And but I think also something that is important to point at is that usually they are not naive in their visions of these instruments. They tend to be quite critical also, and there have been analyses that have pointed also at the sort of resonance of organizational formats of movements with the type of technological format of a medium. There have been activists like Naomi Klein who have reflected on the fact that, for instance, internet, even of the first generations, had an effect on the movements in terms of capacity to spread beyond single issues, addressing several issues. So the more networked is the capacity of the internet, the more the capacity of movements to go beyond pillarized structures and create linkages with others. So I think that there are both types. So I think it's a means that it has also, however, some technological characteristics that make for a continual attempt by the different actors to develop right strategies to use it. So the shift to the, as some of you mentioned, the creation of trains type of railway system, the creations of printed media, the televisions and so on, and also their own opportunities and constraints. Some actors are more technologically savvy, are more sophisticated in the use of some types of technologies or trust more some type of technologies, but I think it is a matter of empirical analysis also to see how they tend to address this.
Thank you. I think we have time for a last round of questions, so if there are other questions. Dan, you want to break the ice?
Yeah, I'd very much like to do that. I've actually got a comment for you. I really appreciated what you said about this moment of thickened history. It made me pause to think about some recent research on, because you said, there are moments when there are empty spaces that become occupied, for instance, by reactionary movements and other types of actors. And there's really interesting research on keyword squatting by extreme right actors in the US, and how that is used when such actors, for instance, try to optimize search engine queries. They kind of home in on a set of words, and then they kind of, they set up a website and they build an ecosystem around that website so that the keyword starts to trend, and then it becomes a story that the mainstream media will pick up. And this is something that, for instance, Ethan and Yochai Benkler have also looked at how that transition happens. So I just wanted to say that, that I can already, this article on keyword squatting is something that's going to come out by Amelia Acker and Joan Donovan, and it really resonates with the theorization that you were just giving us there.
Thank you, Dan. I think, in fact, that it is more general questions or important questions to compare what social movements means on the right and on the left, because on the one hand there has been already in the past a lot of mimicking on the right of what the left was doing. Even the Nazis, the fascist movements were doing some keywords, whatever, in the sense that they used type of symbols, sometimes even day-specific recurrences, days, or important anniversaries, and languages which they took from the left. And this is something that we see a lot in movements like the ones so-called anti-gender, in their attempt to present themselves as victims, or calling for freedom of speech, and imitating a lot of the type of communicative narratives of the left. But on the other hand, what researchers pointed at is also some differences. For instance, the research by David Paternotte and others on the anti-gender movements, they pointed at the fact that very often they don't have a massive characters, but they tend to use the media in order to pretend to be many, but this is one of the weaknesses in terms of transparencies of new medias, that you can, say, fake a lot of likes, for instance, or this type of symbols of supports. And so this research pointed at the fact that what looks like massive supports is very often the active mobilizations of very few people. But there are also other types of characteristics in these movements that make them very different from the progressive movements. For instance, there has been interpretations of right-wing populism as the reactions by the weak and the losers. In reality, if we look at the communication strategies and the sort of political economy that you were mentioning of this type of groups, we see that they are supported by extremely powerful groups, powerful from the point of view of material resources that have financed a lot of these campaigns, but also powerfully in terms of recognition. So the anti-gender movements have been sponsored by actors within the Vatican, not the whole Vatican, but there has been a strong support by strong and mainstream religious groups. And this also implies that in the communications there is some type of, specific characteristics, which is lack of authenticity. Also because in the other cases, conceptions of communications and democracies are extremely restricted, vertical, and so on. And so I think that also they're looking at the type of constraints that the normative conceptions of the communication brings about is also relevant when looking at the ways in which these actors frame the aims.
Thank you, Donatella. Very, very interesting. I think we can close this first session, this first keynote. Thank you very much, Donatella. And so now we can move to the two rooms of the school for the the first session of panels, and then we will be again together in the basement, and we will go in front of the school for a light dinner afterwards, after the panel session, okay? Just a recommendation to the paper givers, the chairs, and the discussant. Please try to be on time. Thank you.
Try to.
Grazie.
Niente.
Ho fatto un po' l'avvocato del diavolo.
No, permetteva anche di...
Very nice.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a great opening.
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Fantastic.
Because